Okay, hi everybody. I'm Cheryl Hung. I'm Director of Ecosystem at the CNCF. So previously, before this, I was working at one of these fabulous companies that is sponsoring today's event. So storage is definitely something that's very close to my heart. So would you like, actually maybe you can all introduce yourselves. Go for it.
Hi.
Do you want to come forwards a bit as well?
I'm part of Equinix's Edge Service engineering group. I manage our security function. And the reason I'm here is I've been working on storage security for last close to 10 years now. I used to work for a company called Warmatric that was into storage security. And at Equinix, we have been working on building various edge-related products. And we have been using Kubernetes heavily. We also recently launched an open source initiative, which is called as Smart Key, which is our key management service. It's integration with Kubernetes. I think I'll pause there.
Hi, folks. My name is Vaibhava. I'm a program manager on the Azure storage team at Microsoft. I've been in Azure for about 8 years, working both on public cloud infrastructure as well as the edge. And I work with a number of folks in the ecosystem partnerships that we have who are sort of at the back here of the room.
Does it work? My name is Michael Corsi, and I'm working in a company called Sopra Steria since 5 years now. And I'm a DevOps architect, which means that I help teams to build DevOps solution for their application lifecycle.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions that I'm going to kick off with, and then I'll try and take some questions from the audience. And then we should finish about 3:50, 3:55. Okay? So first of all, so what's your use case for storage, and how do you manage the stateful applications?
Sure. So for us at Equinix, so I don't know if you are familiar with Equinix. Equinix has been into the data center business. However, that has been changing since last couple of years. We have been becoming a service provider as well. And as part of that, we are launching a few SaaS initiatives. And as part of that, we have been using Kubernetes heavily, especially in terms of Smart Key. Our use case is it's a geographically distributed service. It runs in multiple regions. And there are various compliance requirements behind Smart Key. So what we do is currently we use Kubernetes to manage some of our stateful applications. Especially at the back end, we use Cassandra DB, CockroachDB, some of the databases. And one of the biggest problems that we have been facing is, especially from separation of duty point of view, how do you define where the administrators stop, as in where the IT administrators don't have access to the internal data, and where the security team picks up. So that's one of our heavy use cases. And I think I'll let Weba add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm here very much to bring sort of the platform perspective to things. So we actually have a number of customers who are running Kubernetes-based stateful applications on Azure. The typical use cases around it tend to be things like databases, so MongoDB, Cassandra DB that you mentioned, as well as Elasticsearch, Kafka. Those are very common applications that we've seen.
And I'm going to say about the same thing that my two colleagues. If you read the Holy Bible, the 12-factor apps, we should not build a database on Kubernetes, but actually it doesn't work. We are in the situation where we must build database on Kubernetes for the main reason that we don't have database as a service everywhere. And even if we have database as a service, we most of the time don't have the database we need. For instance, we can have MySQL and Postgre, but we don't have Elasticsearch. So how can we handle that? And at the end, all that finished to be a database in Kubernetes.
Okay, great. Can you talk about some of the day two challenges that you've seen? So for example, observability or lifecycle management?
Yes. So as far as day two goes, one of the things that has been sticking out for us is backup and restore. As soon as, because our data gets encrypted, and since it is the applications are managed through Kubernetes, we have a hard time figuring out which encryption key belongs to which backup, and then deciphering that. And as soon as we start talking about doing recovery, we had to, as service provider, also maintain a log of things, as in who had access to which backup and how they restored, and how that corresponding person got access to the data encryption key as well. So that's one of the day-to challenges we have seen so far. So that has become almost a day-to-day challenge for us. Originally, we were doing just manual bookkeeping. We literally had one of our administrators and SRE engineer just making notes in a notepad and just assigning timestamps to the backups, rather taking the timestamps from the backup, associating it with an encryption key. So that has been a very daunting task for us even to this day. So far, over last 1 year, we have managed to automate some of these processes, and also started working on how we integrate with Kubernetes and maybe extend the Kubernetes platform as well. But that's still an unsolved problem for us.
Actually, to sort of add to that as well, so we definitely see a number of data challenges really associated with performance, scalability or scale out of applications, as well as definitely backup and DR and monitoring. From a monitoring standpoint, we do everything we can in terms of exposing all the metrics that you need as part of integration with open source tooling like Prometheus to be able to actually view what's going on. As well as from a backup and restore standpoint, we help customers sort of leverage open source capabilities. Valero Restic is something that a number of customers have used, and we have some great customer stories around the implementations that we can share, as well as we work with a number of folks who are in the room here, so Kasten and as well as Portworx.
Sorry, if you don't mind sort of interrupting there. So I forgot to mention one thing earlier. So our open source initiative, that is the KMS plugin for Kubernetes, that ironically was driven by our own internal requirement. Over last 1 year, we detected that apparently our HCD store, that was not being encrypted. And we looked around for a few options, and that's when we, during a backup restore scenario, we figured out many of us accidentally had access to that HCD store, and that's how some of these initiatives are also forking in. But the challenge still remains: how do we associate a backup, and how do we generate a consistent audit log trail, especially as a service provider for auditors to inspect? So that still remains a challenge. Please.
You speak for me. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. Go ahead, go on.
No, it's mainly the same thing. We have a backup and restore challenge, mainly. And we start to have the performance challenge as well, especially because the storage is most of the time a network storage. And we have a problem of localization, of data localization, which means that when you have to write a very, very big batch of data, then in this situation, database on Kubernetes could be less performant than a regular database. But as long as you are using regularly your database for an equal read and write process, it's fine, but it's not always the case. And in this case, we have a very big challenge, beside the backup and restore challenge.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience. So does anyone have any questions for any of our panelists? Okay. I'll keep going. Okay, so do operators or Helmcharts help you with these day 2 operations?
Yes. Using Helmchart or operator, I think it's a no discuss. I think operator is the winner, definitively the winner. Because when you use Helmchart, it's cool, it set up your database, but then you are alone with it. You can't do anything. With operator, you can manage the life cycle of your database. So, in my opinion, operator is the way to go for the database, not anymore the Helmchart. I mean, in this case, operator is going to kill the Helmchart. Anyway.
So I agree with you for sure in the context that if you use Helm, it's great to define the application, but then once your deployment is done, you don't really have that application context. So one area that was sort of mentioned earlier in the keynote today was that Microsoft and Alibaba are working together and have proposed the open application model, which is really going to help sort of define that application definition and keep that sort of alive as the application progresses through the life cycle. So that's an area that we believe will really help with day two operations as well going forward. So we're really excited to kind of see how the community embraces that.
My vote goes to operators as well. And as far as we are concerned, as I mentioned, we have been doing some of the things a little archaic way as well. But if I had to choose, I would definitely choose operators.
And are there any other tools or processes that you found that are helpful for day two operations?
For me, there was no really another tool that helped instead out of the operators. The thing we can say is that when you manage the database in Kubernetes, then you have a unified way of managing your database. You don't need to install your client. Let's imagine that you want to make a PSQL, for instance. You just do a kubectl exec, and that's it. It works directly in your terminal. You have nothing to install. You have no network to set up. It just works. So it brings a more... Kubernetes is the tool to have a unified way to manage your database. But there's no specific database tool, to my knowledge.
Would you agree?
Yes. I would add, so for us, one of the things we have been doing is monitoring, especially for any SaaS offering. It's very difficult. Rather, one of the constant tasks is, can you prove your uptime? How do you calculate your uptime? As in, what our Kubernetes shows is okay, but give me an end user perspective of it. And especially our services running across the globe, we have been tinkering around with few professional tools, but we have been categorically also using Grafana and Prometheus, especially feeding in Kubernetes application state-related information, as well as some of the end user experience. So we actually manage some of our monitoring infrastructure as well. So we run few probes in the cloud as well as within the Equinix owned data centers as well. And that gives aggregated view. So internally we have developed some tool based on Grafana and Prometheus to just provide that whole end user view. So for customers that they are not interested in knowing how many instances of Kubernetes we are running or how many masters are running internally, but they are interested in knowing just the end state of the application itself or the service itself. So for example, calculating an SLA, how many number of nines have you survived, say over last 1 month or last 1 year. So we have been using some of these tools from monitoring point of view.
I guess the one thing that I will add is that in addition to sort of the support for the cloud native tools, there are, each platform also has some serverless and other technology which really integrates with some of these capabilities. And so as an example, just as an example with Azure, we integrate the Azure monitoring capability with all the metrics that we get from Kubernetes. So it's exposed to the administrator who's really looking at the different monitoring components of the different capabilities, but then you can then integrate those with things like Azure Functions to be able to take sort of post-action operations based on the data. So it's just an example of one platform, but each platform also comes with its own serverless technology that you can integrate and use.
Hi. Can you grab a mic? Yeah.
No, because we recorded it. I was wondering if you guys deploying a pipeline of applications with databases and ingest a number of the components constitute the function, how do you manage with something like performance management and availability management when there's many, many pods and many, many data stores contributing to this application stack?
Can you just repeat the question one more time? Sorry. It's quite noisy here because of a fan, so you can be quite loud.
Sorry, it might be me. Is it loud enough?
It's better.
A lot of the application deployments constitute multiple components, databases, front-end applications, stateful and stateless. in such a pipeline, how do you guys manage availability and performance when it comes to configuration, relationship between these applications when they're running in multiple pods and multiple data stores?
Did you get that?
So the question was, how do we measure the performance of the database when we integrate it with the other software? And how we make sure that we don't have some loss on performance compared to a regular database that we could install in bare metal? That was your question? And availability. Okay. So I can speak about one of my use case. We were a bit afraid. We installed a PostgreSQL database on OpenShift, and as you maybe know, we had to use a network plugin called OpenVSwitch, and we were wondering if we could have some problem of performance because we use another network storage. Then we also have the question that are we going to be as performant as we could be with bare metal because the storage was unsafe instead of bare metal. So we run some PG bench to check if we didn't lose performance. And when it comes to write a lot, we clearly lose performance. But we notice that if we improve the quantity of memory, then we can get back to regular performance. And to be absolutely clear, we didn't really run some performance tests. We just face ourselves in the situation where we had some performance problem. We had to make tunings. And every time we were able to come back to regular database performance on a very, very heavy workload. I mean, it was something like nearly 1,000 transactions per second, and it worked. It just worked. But this is not going to give you a method to check that on Kubernetes. I agree, except if you run PG. So I remember that I built a pod with PGBench inside, and then we were used to run it and to just get the result. But not sure that I'm answering properly your question. Okay.
So just to add there, so for us, we have been heavily relying on our CI/CD pipeline from performance point of view. So what we do is during our CI/CD, the deployment process itself, performance is one of the criteria that the application has to go through. And that's just one part of the step that we use. Along with that, we periodically do random checks within our systems. So for example, even after you go through the CI/CD pipeline, but during lifetime of that specific application, something may go wrong or some settings might change. It could be any event. So in order to sort of keep a tab on that, we also do some random audits internally. So along with these regular CI/CD performance executions, there is a random check of the application itself. So we have some of our external bots. They actually bid on our service as an end user. And that internally we do have some alert setup as well, especially for storage as well as database performance. So we, as I mentioned earlier, the monitoring tools, so they heavily integrate with our databases themselves as well. So they, as soon as these checks are done, they send out alerts as well, depending on the threshold values which are set up. I hope that addresses the performance-related question. And there was another part to the question
Availability.
Related to availability. So as far as availability goes, so as I mentioned earlier regarding the SLAs, so we do perform SLA checks as an availability checks from an end user point of view. So instead of looking at doing an introspection, we usually sit outside the system and look at it from an end user point of view purely. So because there are times when some of the pods may go down, but that's what the system is built for. Even if one pod is unavailable, the system is still able to serve. So that doesn't mean that the system has been performing at a given threshold. It may be performing slightly below that threshold, but at least the systems are available. So the SLA checks are usually, so for us, we keep doing them from end user point of view. And we do it from multiple locations to eliminate some of the things like, say, challenges with networking. As in, just one factor which plays a role at times is the network connectivity. So depending on the location from where you are connecting to your application, and the network connectivity between those two locations, your availability might change, as in view of your availability will change. So in order to eliminate that, we do run multiple of these probes. And so your availability is an aggregated view of multiple probes.
Just a quick thought to add from a platform standpoint. So the first thing is from an availability standpoint, you're absolutely right. It's super critical. We enable different deployment configurations. So whether it is sort of localized to one zone or sort of cross-zonal deployments. And so that's definitely something that improves the application availability in addition to kind of the underlying storage platform itself. In terms of performance, again, the problem that you call out is hard. And so the thing that we do is, I think that, again, there are a lot of unique things that come with each platform. So for example, one of the things, if customers have specific low latency requirements, one of the things that we work with is for read-heavy applications, we have something called a read-only cache, and we kind of worked with the volume driver to ensure that that is enabled. And so that actually brings up the IOPS and reduces latency significantly. And so there is always some platform-specific elements that will come into play. And typically, if you keep those in mind, you should be able to sort of optimize for whatever platform you're deploying on.
And I would finish to say, but when you have performance problem, most of the time, where does it come from? From the development or from the database? And the answer is 99% of the time from the development. That's another point that we may notice.
I think we've got time for one more audience question.
Anyone else have one more question? Here we
Okay.
go. Oh, that's two, but we'll do it to you since you're closer. Thanks.
So Anand, you talk about the backup and restore has been traditional challenge for CNA workloads. May I know besides?
We can't hear you. Can you?
Be a bit louder.
Okay. So can you hear me now? Better?
Yes.
Okay. Anand, I heard you talk about backup and restore has been a challenge. Compared to the legacy workload, CNA workload, I believe, adds lots of additional requirements. For example, application level backup and restore. Besides that, is there anything else? For example, developer-enabled solutions, or we still can just handle traditional VI admins targeting for those as the backup user?
Can you repeat the last part?
The last part is saying compared to the legacy applications, for example, our backup user is targeting for the traditional VI admins. Well, for the CNA applications, is there any other requirement, such as we need to handle or we need to provide a backup solution for developers?
So as far as requirement goes, it has been mostly from auditability point of view. As in, so for end users, so we hold on to key. So especially in case of key management service, we hold on to sensitive material, and they want to be able to figure out how exactly you went about doing things internally. So in case of a backup restore scenario, so typically, the backup restore solutions or many of the management functions, they're available to the systems administrators. And so there is no notion of separate security administrator there. And once you run into some of these situations where you have to restore something, it's very difficult to have that clear-cut boundary between what is a management function and what is a security function, because some of these administrators, they rely on, after the data is restored, correctness of the data as well. So they want to be able to even look at maybe the results, not the data itself, but at least integrity of the data, that the data is still intact. So that still remains to be a challenge. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
So what will help is if, again, I'm just probably dreaming, but if I close my eyes, then in an ideal world, I see one of our SREs being able to restore the data, but not able to figure out what exactly went into the data, or rather even the backup that got restored. but somehow magically, again, I'm just doing plenty of guesswork here, but somehow magically, the administrator being able to point to an encryption key, which can be used for this recovery operation. But only a security administrator will hold on to some magic secret sauce which will enable that operation. So it has to be, one of the things we have been trying to implement is maybe a lockstep approach. Instead of overloading one function, say management doing everything, maybe have multiple of these parties involved, as in security team, as well as storage management team do a coordinated activity. But currently there is no tool which facilitates this. So that's where we have been doing our manual bookkeeping, as in make entries into a notepad and we stash it into a log trail somewhere. So that's where we are at. So that's been one of our very primary requirements, especially as a service provider.
So, do you want to make a comment?
To me, just to kind of add to that, for sure, I think the sort of change in what you see is really moving from that sort of traditional infrastructure, backup and restore kind of viewpoint to the application-centric viewpoint, and we had a couple people talk about that today. But that's definitely the piece that really brings the developer into the fold and makes it kind of something that they can wrap their heads around, really kind of keeping the application enclosed in certain components and then being able to back up and restore those. So I definitely think that's kind of the way forward.
Okay. And for me, we use the Kasten software that I presented just previously. So it brings a default policy for every developer. So the things is just backup every week. And they can, on their own, do the restore. So it's a self-service restore system. And finally, we change our politic. Before we were saying that saving and restore is the responsibility of the developers. And actually it didn't work because it's hard to implement properly backup, restore, retention, polishing, and all that stuff. So now we have this software, and it's much more easy. It's a self-service system that you can use to restore your backup. It's much easier, I think.
So I think we're out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up there. But Anand, Vibhav, Michael, thank you very much. A round of applause, please.